Your book, Existential Physics, begins with a mental health warning. Why did you put that in there?
Because I have gotten a lot of emails in response to what I've written and said about the absence of free will. So I think that we don't have free will, and it made me realize that some people find it hard to cope with. And they ask me, like, so what's the point of life if we don't have free will? To which I don't really have a good answer. So I wanted to put this out, at the beginning. It might, and personally, I found it very difficult. Like when I was a student, studied physics, so you get to the point where you're like, okay, so that's how everything works. Like this is like fundamentally, this is what we're all made up of, right? Atoms, and they do this thing, and so where's the space for free will? And we can talk about this in more detail, but it's taken me some time to wrap my head around it and get comfortable with it. And so I wanted people to know what they are getting into, basically.
Yeah, I suppose there's an expectation sometimes on physicists or indeed philosophers who come up with these crazy ideas like free will doesn't exist, or there's no such thing as ethics, or questions about God or whatnot. And then people come to them and say, oh, so what should we do in light of that information? And
Right.
it's like,
Right.
well, how should I know? I'm just here to diagnose a problem or tell you something I think is true. It's up to you to figure out how to deal with that. But do you recognize, I mean, in the areas you touch on as a physicist, you're talking about free will, you're talking about consciousness, you talk about God sometimes. Do you recognize the desperation in comments like that? Like when someone says to you, I'm having an existential crisis, do you say, I'm sorry to hear it, but, I don't relate to that? Or is that something that you also have sort of gone through, but just managed over time to deal with?
Well, yeah, I did go through it and I managed to deal with it. And no, I definitely don't ignore such comments because I worry about people. And I try to help them because, I mean, I kind of managed to make peace with it and I try to convey that to people, but still I don't know, does it actually work? Right. So that's why I worry. I understand why people might find it hard. Like what's the purpose of anything? What do I do? What do I do with my life? Why do anything? Um, so I kind of feel like I'm a little bit the wrong person to talk about it, but I feel like I can't not do it basically.
Yeah. Well, what are the principal areas? You already mentioned free will, which I think people can understand why not believing in free will would cause an existential crisis. But some people might be surprised to think, I thought that Alex's guest today was a physicist. And yet we've opened here by alluding to these existential problems, which are usually in the realm of philosophy. So what other areas can a physicist be writing about and touching on that get people to send you emails like that?
So one rather obvious question or topic that physicists like to talk about is the beginning of the universe or the origin of everything, as some people would put it. And generally, like the question, like where is space for God? Anything beyond the fundamental laws of nature? There's also, and this has become much more widely discussed in the past 2 years with AI being everywhere. Is there anything special about consciousness? Or, I mean, this
Hmm.
is the way that people put it, but I think what they really mean is there's something special about us.
Yeah.
Right. And I think some people find this really, really important. Like there's something different about us that we can't build with a machine. And I just think there isn't. Basically, I think we're all machines in some sense, just made out of other stuff, and there's no reason why a computer shouldn't be able to become conscious. And I do think that physics has something to say about it because fundamentally we're all made of atoms.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you have a whole chapter in your book It's called something like "Are We All Just a Bunch of Atoms?" or something like this, which discusses this idea of what, if anything, makes human beings or sentient minds special. And yeah, I mean, it does feel as though there's me and there's, this microphone that's sat in front of me, as I like to point to as an example all of the time. And well, what's the difference between them? Okay, the size, shape, and color, but it also seems like there's something that there is like what it's like to be me in a way that there's not a what it's like to be the microphone. And that seems to have something to do with the internal first-person perspective, feelings, the fact that I can close my eyes and imagine things that the microphone doesn't have. So I've spoken to philosophers about this over and over again. Where does this consciousness thing come from? But from a physicist's perspective, if we are just talking about atoms bumping together, you can understand why people find it so difficult to imagine that if you throw atoms together in the right order, you create a rock or a microphone or some water. Or if you put them together in the right order, then you get first-person conscious experience and imaginary rocks and imaginary numbers and all kinds of stuff like that. That just seems totally incomprehensible for some people.
Yeah, well, so I want to start by saying that the German title of the book is Mehr als nur Atome, which means more than just atoms. So the point is, we're more than just atoms. So it's not just about the things that we're made of. It's about the way that they're connected. It's about what they can do, which is exactly what you just said, right? So the human brain can do more than your microphone. It's just much more complex. So that's the question. Like, is this the only thing? Like, is this the only difference? That the human brain has just many more connections, many more things going on, and it has many more emergent features, as philosophers like to put it, than your microphone. And I think the answer is yes. That's it. It's at the moment the human brain is much more complex than anything else we can think of, but it may not remain that way. And so it's a related argument that I bring up in the book is this question, like, do we actually need these atoms? Or can we make it of something? Can we build consciousness from something else? So there's the question, like, do we actually need this particular biological substrate, so to speak? Is it somehow essential? And I think that physics tells us that the answer is no, because we know that the exact details of what's going on beyond a certain scale, at very short distances, actually don't matter for exactly how information is being sent around in the brain. It's got something to do with the way that things are connected. And that makes me think there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to reproduce this with some other system, be it silicon or whatever they now work with. I always hear people talk of graphene, but it never seems to become reality. Yeah. So I totally think you can do it on some other system. That doesn't mean that we've actually managed to do it yet.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for a lot of people, they sort of just have this confidence that one day we'll work out how that process would work. But if we could conceivably just put atoms together in the same way, there's that thought experiment of replacing every neuron in your brain with like a transistor or something, and if you just replaced one single neuron with a transistor or some kind of silicon, would you notice a difference? And the answer is like, no. I think everything would function the same and the brain would still act in the same way. And well, if you just kept doing that over and over again, at what point would consciousness switch off? It kind of seems like it wouldn't, right? But on the other hand, there is this feeling that, like, I mean, the question I always ask people is quite like visually laden, but a lot of people can't like visualize things in their head. I don't know if you're one of these people who can close your eyes and imagine the color red, for example. Some people say that they can't, some people can, but at the very least you can probably imagine a triangle, right, in your head if you think of it, and it's got three sides and there are things that are true and there are false about it. And so is it your view that, say, this triangle that I'm picturing in my head right now just somehow like is the same thing as some kind of atomic structure within my brain. Because I think the dualist will think, no, that triangle exists in the mind because it's got spatial extension. It's got 3 sides, for example. Your brain, the atoms in your brain doesn't have those properties. So what's your view on that discussion? Like, what is this triangle? Where does it exist? How does it exist?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an atomic structure because that makes it sound like it is some sort of material in your brain that you're assembling.
Right.
But it's something something that's going on in the circuits in your brain is what I would say. Yeah, actually, I think we don't even have to speculate about this because people are now doing brain experiment, not my area, but where they can basically read out what images people are thinking of. And so, I mean, it's, at the time it's not great, but at some point we'll probably be able to do it.
Yeah, I see. And so, like, by looking at the brain structure, we'll be able to sort of see what it is that they're picturing in their heads, something like that, which at least shows an intimate connection between those two things. But for me, I've always tripped up on this mystery of the line between like the mental activity associated with the experience and the experience itself. In philosophy, the experience itself, as separate from the mental activity, there's a word for it, they call it qualia, right? And you've just put out a video about how science might have something to say on qualia. It's often thought that that's kind of where the science-philosophy divide is with consciousness. Science deals with the brain, philosophy deals with qualia, but what is it that was, interesting enough about the relationship between science and qualia that made you think you need to make a video about it recently?
Yeah, so maybe let me say a more general thing. So I do these science news. I report on what other people do.
Mhm.
It's not that I did this research or something.
Yeah.
And so what the video was about is that I see this trend of people work in neurobiology or neuro something who write papers about how they've measured qualia. Like it's a thing. And so the video was about this trend basically that it's this qualia is moving from the side of philosophy to the side of science where they just go and measure it. At least they call it qualia. I guess that there are philosophers who would disagree that this even is qualia.
Hmm.
So of course, if you define it as something that's unmeasurable, then we don't have to talk about it because you've defined it that way. So that makes it by definition unscientific. But I think if you're talking about this spirit of what was qualia supposed to be, like this subjective experience, then you can measure it. It's something that's going on in your brain circuits. Of course, that doesn't mean that somebody else can experience exactly the same. Because, well, I would say we're the only way that somebody else can experience the same as some other persons if they actually are that person. So that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's interesting what you just said about defining your terms. It's like, well, okay, scientists are beginning to study qualia, but philosophers look at that and go, well, the fact that you're studying it means it can't be qualia because, qualia is something that can't be measured. When you think of like redness or a triangle in your head or something, do you think, do you like understand the philosophers' critique where they say that there is something about that individual experience of redness which is just inaccessible to the scientific method? As in, like, do you think that it's appropriate to call qualia that thing which is inaccessible to science? Or are you sort of more optimistic about the breadth of what science can do?
I don't know what the part would be that's inaccessible to science. So you do have an experience. We can measure that in principle, maybe not in practice yet, but in principle we could. So I don't see what else there is. I'm sorry, I'm a physicist all the way down.
The famous Mary's room thought experiment. There's
Yeah.
the girl in the room. So for the audience, there's a girl in a room called Mary, and we can imagine that she's given access to all of the information that could exist about the color blue. That is not just like the Wikipedia page that we've got today, But like every bit of information we could ever have about the wavelengths, about the science of the eye, about the psychology of the brain, she reads up and is an expert on all of it, but she's never seen the color blue. But she knows everything that could be put into words about the color blue. And the question is, if she then, after learning all of that, walks outside and sees blue for the first time, does she learn anything new? And for a lot of people, intuitively, the answer is yes. But if the physicist says that everything about the experience of blue can be described in sort of scientific language, would you therefore say that she doesn't learn anything new when she steps outside of that room? Or is there some sort of third answer that I'm missing?
First of all, I'm now super confused because I thought the color was red, not blue. But I mean, you never know. Maybe her blue is my red, or the other way
Yeah,
around.
exactly. Yeah, who knows?
Yeah. No, of course she learns something new when she gets when she goes outside, because suddenly she has photons of a certain wavelength hitting her eyes, and that sparks some reaction which she didn't have before. So it's just a different thing. So of course, just having a physical sensory input isn't the same as learning everything about what the brain does in response to that input. So those are just two different things.
I see.
So I guess the question you could ask is like, imagine she had all this information about what people experience when they see the color red or blue, whatever. And she also had a sort of brain stimulation machine by the help of which she could, excite certain neurons in her brain if she knew exactly what to do. Would she have the experience of seeing the color red? And my answer to this would be probably yes. Going by everything we know about how similar brains are. Now, you could always argue that, of course, strictly speaking, your red isn't exactly the same as my red because our brains are slightly different. But I would say, well, they're probably similar enough.
That's really interesting. I guess that would count as a third option, which is that to sort of truly know everything about blue without seeing blue, you would also know exactly how to prod the brain in the right way to bring about the experience of blue, such that if she had the correct equipment to prod the brain in that way, she could bring about that experience of blue and learn what that experience was like without actually seeing something blue like in the room. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, right.
That's interesting.
So you don't actually need the photon hitting your eye if you know what it does in response in your brain, basically.
I see. That's cool. That's cool. And so the center of consciousness is the brain, and consciousness is just like the product of complex arrangements of things, or something like that. Like atoms arranged in a complex enough manner gives this centralized experience of consciousness. Because one of the other mysteries is like why if there are lots of moving parts all put together, why there's like this one singular, center for the consciousness,
Yeah, well, so I think at this point it gets very difficult because we don't actually know exactly how consciousness works, and everyone has their own theory about it. And I think it's probably quite complicated. You need different specialized parts of the brain that do different things. But
and you think that that's ultimately going to be a scientific rather than a philosophical question, or do you think that that's a bit of a phony distinction?
I think it's going to move from the philosophical realm into the scientific realm, and we're witnessing this move right now, basically. So at the moment, I think if you look at those theories of consciousness, they're all very, very basic. And I find them all quite unconvincing. But I don't know, give it 100 years. Who knows if AI comes and they'll solve the problem in about no time. Yeah.
There is also this, I guess, perception amongst some people that science and philosophy are at odds, to the extent that a lot of physicists look at philosophy and sort of think that it's a watered down or ancient version of what the physicist is doing. I'm thinking of people like Lawrence Krauss who've just said that philosophy is kind of nonsense. I think it assumes that there's like an empiricism to knowledge, that like anything that can be meaningfully known is something that is open to the scientific method, is testable, that kind of stuff. Given that you've written quite extensively on what people would call philosophical topics in existential physics, what is your relationship to philosophy generally? Do you look at it that way, or do you have a bit more time for it?
Well, I'd say there's good philosophy and there's bad philosophy,
Oh yeah.
but so you need to know what to look at. But actually, I think there's a second order problem with the physicists that look down on philosophy, which is that a lot of philosophers think that all physicists look down on philosophy. So I get a lot of hate from philosophers
Yeah.
because I'm supposedly dismissive of philosophy, and I'm like, no, I'm just dismissive of what I think is bad philosophy, like panpsychism, if you want to talk about this at some point. But no, I actually think that most physicists, and I totally disagree with Lawrence Krauss on this, don't take philosophy seriously enough, especially when it comes to the foundations of physics. Like think of stuff like quantum mechanics. You need to know, like, where does the science end, where does the philosophy start, and I think physicists are really, really bad at figuring out where they cross over into philosophy, and this is where a lot of things go wrong. And I wrote about some of these issues already in my first book, when they make mathematical assumptions that are actually metaphysical, and they don't see the difference. Like, so they think it's a requirement. It needs to be. It's mathematical, right? When it's actually, something else that they postulate the laws of nature must be like. And so I think that this is a huge problem, which is why I got interested in that. And then, as you probably know, philosophy is kind of a rabbit hole. As once you start looking into it,
That's for
there's no
sure.
end.
I I'm really interested in what you said about, I guess, like philosophical assumptions that people unknowingly embed into their scientific worldview. So famously, Albert Einstein sees that his equations point to a finite universe or something like this, and so he adds in his cosmological constant to his equation so that the universe could be eternal, because of course philosophically he knew that the universe had to be eternal, just like Aristotle thought and everyone in between. And so he adds in this constant and later takes it out again and calls it his greatest blunder, right? And that blunder that Einstein, if Einstein can do it, we can all do it, made was a result of essentially a philosophical assumption that, well, the universe has to be eternal because otherwise it sort of wouldn't make sense. And we now don't think that's the case. At least this universe is probably not eternal. But that philosophical assumption changed what Einstein ended up, finalizing his equation as, if I'm not mistaken. And I suppose that's something that can sort of crop up everywhere. One of the really big assumptions philosophically that seems to send people into an absolute frenzy when it comes to all areas of science is the existence of free will. You've already mentioned it, but there's a particular area of application here. Now, I'm hoping you can help me understand this. I did a video recently called The Existential Crisis Iceberg, where I went through all the different levels of ideas that might give you an existential crisis. And somewhere near the bottom was this thing called superdeterminism. Now, superdeterminism is something like determinism, but as applied to the quantum realm. Everything is ultimately fundamentally determined. And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of physicists reject this. They say superdeterminism is nonsense, and at least a lot of them do that because they have to assume that free will exists, or something like that. Can you help me understand what's going on there?
That's a very interesting question. I think this has a long historical backstory. So, if you don't mind, I'll try to briefly summarize it. So, we already talked about Einstein. Einstein, for all I know, didn't have any strong feelings on this free will thing, but Niels Bohr did. So, Niels Bohr interestingly enough, thought he wanted quantum mechanics to be indeterministic because he thought that makes room for free will, which I think is a position that most philosophers now reject. But for him, it was that's actually what he wrote, if I remember this correctly, in some letters to Einstein. So for Bohr, who's often credited with being kind of the father of the Copenhagen interpretation, this was really important. So now Einstein had misgivings about quantum mechanics that didn't have anything to do with free will, but it was that the measurement process, so the collapse of the wave function, is faster than light. And of course, Einstein didn't like this, right? This is what he called spooky action at a distance. So he tried very hard. He had a long argument with Bohr to try to pin it down, like something is wrong, and he ultimately failed at it. But he had this idea that there is an underlying, probably deterministic reality in which particles all have definite properties. So there's nothing of that sort going on, that you can't measure two things at the same time, or that particle goes into places. He didn't like that sort of stuff. He thought a particle goes one place, and that's at the end of the story. We just don't know where the particle is going. So, and so Einstein died, and then came John Bell, who tried to finally pin down the difference between the Einstein view and the Copenhagen interpretation. And this is where Bell's theorem comes from. So he said, let's assume that Einstein was right, and there is this underlying reality which is deterministic, and it has no spooky action. It's local. There's nothing like a collapse going on. Then what are the predictions that this sort of theory generically would make, and how does it compare to quantum mechanics? And so now, here's the thing. In his proof, he made an assumption, which is now called often the free will assumption. And you need this assumption that the experimenter has free will to derive this inequality, which basically says that the Einstein type local deterministic theories obey an inequality which we know experimentally is violated. So if you make this assumption, if you make the free will assumption, then the Einstein idea is ruled out. If you throw out this assumption, you get what's called superdeterminism. And then you can reproduce our observations with a local deterministic theory of the type that Einstein might have had in mind, or might not. Unfortunately, we don't know what he would have thought about this. But so this is the reason why free will became tied up with this superdeterminism thing. Now, the issue is, though, that if you look at exactly what do they mean with free will, it doesn't have anything to do with what philosophers normally, or even, standard people on the street, let's not even talk about philosophers, mean by free will. It's an assumption that's, more technically it's known as measurement independence. It's got something to do with the correlation between the thing that you want to measure and the measurement settings. You can choose measurement settings with a computer. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with free will. But so this is where it came from. And I think part of the reason this happened is that Bell himself, in his original proof of the theorem, seemed to have not noticed that he even made this assumption. So this was later pointed out to him by, among other things, John Clauser, one of the guys who won the Nobel Prize in 2022, that there was this extra assumption, which Bell then justified by alluding to free will.
I see.
So you can kind of think, so like, he must have thought, like, damn, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly there's this hole in his theorem. So he had to come up with a reason for why we need this assumption, and
that
so he
was
called
free
it
will.
that was free will. Yeah.
Interesting. So let me see if I've got this right. Right. So we've got this weird quantum stuff that goes on. People can imagine like the double slit experiment where there's like a wave pattern, but if you observe it, then it's a particle. All a little bit strange. And so there's this Copenhagen interpretation which says that the electron is actually a sort of cloud of probability, a wave function, which is a sort of prediction of probabilities of all the places it can go. And when you observe it, what happens is that wave function collapses, so to speak, and the particle is in a particular place. And that happens when you observe it. Before you observe it, there's this big wave of probability. The problem is that if you've got this wave of probability that goes from my left hand to my right hand, and then I observe it and it collapses and the particle's on my right hand, there needs to be this information over at my left hand that the particle isn't there. But because it happens instantaneously, this information seems to travel from my right hand to my left hand in an instant, which means faster than the speed of light. So Einstein says that can't happen. Therefore, this idea that the electron is just a cloud of probability is wrong. There must be some kind of, foundational nature. It must have a foundational property. We just don't know what that is yet. And so after this, Bell wants to retain the idea that information can't travel faster than the speed of light, that everything is local, in other words. It has to, if it's at my right hand, it stays at my right hand. It can't just zip across space instantly. And in order to retain this locality, he comes up with this Bell's theorem. But that theorem assumes something. It assumes something about the way that the scientist interacts with the experiment, which is an assumption, but he doesn't realize is an assumption. And only later, when that assumption is pointed out to him, he says, okay, well, if we didn't assume that, then free will wouldn't exist. And that was the reason he gave for agreeing with this assumption. But we could just deny that assumption and everything still works. Something like that?
Yeah, almost. I made 2 notes about things that I'm slightly unhappy with. One is you said something about the way that information travels. So there isn't actually any information being exchanged. This is actually the big headache, because if there was information being exchanged faster than the speed of light, then we could measure it. So the entire problem with the collapse of the wave function is that it's completely unobservable. So there's nothing observable actually going faster than the speed of light. I mean, it would actually be cool if that was the case, right? And then we could send information faster than the speed of light, but that isn't so. So this is the one thing. The other thing is that mathematically, this assumption to Bell's theorem doesn't really have anything to do with free will. That's just an interpretation. So what it really is like mathematically, it's a type of correlation between things. And you can try to connect it to the choice that the experimenter has in deciding what to measure. You can actually, since you mentioned the double slit experiment, you can actually see in the double slit experiment why that helps. Because one of the weird things about the double slit experiment is, so you have these 2 slits, and then you get a wave pattern that comes from the interference of the 2 parts of the wave function that go through each slit. So the weird thing about this is that the one particle, even if it's only one particle, it kind of needs to go through both slits to interfere with itself. Because if it goes through only one slit, it can't interfere with itself. So now what you can do is you can put a measurement device into one of the slits. And what happens then is what you said is that the interference pattern goes away. Because now the particle it knows I'm being measured. So it goes only one slit. So either it goes in the detector, then the detector goes pling, or it doesn't, then it goes through the other slit, but you don't get the interference pattern. So now I think you can see from this example that if the particle, what the particle does it split up or does it only go one way, is correlated with what you measure. Do you measure at the slit or do you measure on the screen? Then you can explain what's going on. Because if these two things are correlated, then you have a deterministic variable that tells you, does it go through both slits or does it go through only one?
Yeah.
So this is basically how superdeterminism works.
If there is a correlation between, the observation of the phenomenon or the way that you observe the phenomenon and what actually happens, the phenomenon itself, if there's some kind of correlation between those two, between my looking at the particle and what the particle does, or the detector and what the particle does, then, that's fine. There's no problem. That's why it acts differently when we observe it and when we don't, because there's some correlation between us observing it and what it actually does. But the thing that Bell assumed is statistical independence, right? That is, that there is no correlation between your observation or the detector and the phenomenon itself. And
so it's not that there is no correlation between the observation, but between what you observe.
Right.
So it's like the variable that you actually measure.
Sure.
Is
so
like
what you observe,
the path or the interference on the screen. Yeah.
Sure. So Bell assumes that there is no correlation between those two things. But as a physicist, you could assume that there is a correlation between those two things, and that would mean that Bell was wrong. But Bell wants to say, or at least that his theorem is
right.
incomplete.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a proof, right? And I think no one doubts that the proof is correct. You make assumption ABC, you get results so and so, and then, there are like 10,000 people have repeated. I'm pretty sure it's correct. But there's like the question is, what does it tell us about reality? Like, this is the question, right?
Sure. Okay, so why is it then that when Bell is asked about this, and someone says, "Hey, you've assumed that there's no correlation between observing the path and the result of the where the particle goes or whatever." Why does Bell then say, "Oh, well, we have to assume that because otherwise free will wouldn't exist"? Well, how are they connected? At least in Bell's mind.
Well, that's a very good question. So for one thing, there's generally the issue: how do you reconcile free will with determinism?
Yeah.
Even forget about the super. Like this is already difficult. So and we could stop at this point and say, well, it's deterministic, so free will goes out the window. So this is one answer. The other answer is that what Bell had in mind, and sorry, I'm trying to think of a way to not make this too technical. So if you think about what we just discussed, so what the particle is doing, does it go one slit or both, needs to fit together with the measurement that you make. So it somehow seems that the measurement needs to be just right to fulfill this correlation. And so now your choice of measurement in a deterministic theory always came from an earlier cause. So you can trace everything you do and say and think can be traced back ultimately to the beginning of the universe. And what Bell, I believe, had in mind, and many other people have later said similar things, is that if you believe that this correlation exists between what the particle's doing and your choice of measurement, then your choice, the choice you will go on to make, must have been correlated with what the particle will make all the way back at the beginning of the universe. Yeah. And that seems like an extremely unlikely coincidence, and it's often called a conspiracy of sort, that these two things would fit together in that exact way. So I find this argument quite misleading, because you can always make, like, forget about quantum mechanics. Like, every time you measure anything, you could say, well, but actually my act of measuring this particular thing, or having chosen to study physics, or, eaten this thing for lunch, has other causes, which goes back to other causes, which goes back all the way to the beginning of the universe. Like, you can always say that. And then you can always say, oh, there must have been a great conspiracy in the universe to put together all the atoms of your body so that you came out being exactly the way you are right now. Okay, but no one ever makes this argument. So why do you suddenly make this argument for this particular detector setting?
I think
Okay.
that confusion crops up all the time. So just to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying, we said that the thing Bell assumed is that there is no correlation between like my observation and the effect of the experiment, or the result of the experiment. There's no correlation there. And he says, well, if we assumed a correlation, then free will wouldn't exist. Why? Because if my observation is somehow correlated with what the result of the experiment will be, that implies that both what the result of the experiment are and whether or not I chose to observe it in that way must sort of have been already preordained, because how else could they be like correlated and connected unless they both stem from some prior cause, right? So if you do assume that there's a correlation between the observation and the effect, and that's you could do that, that solves the problem, but it means that there's no free will, because that means that your decision to observe it in that way must have been caused by something prior. And so Bell looks at this and goes, well, I don't really want to assume that there is a correlation. Why not? Oh, because there'd be no free will, because there'd be no choice. But you rightly point out that the problem for free will is much wider and prior to that. I mean, an example I often give is, suppose we're talking about quantum mechanics and whether there is randomness in quantum mechanics or not, right? Is everything determined, or is there some kind of randomness in quantum mechanics? Some people want to say, well, there has to be randomness in quantum mechanics, because otherwise there could be no free will. Because if everything was ultimately determined, there'd be no free will. And so if there's no randomness in the universe, we'd have to do away with free will. And it's kind of confused, because even if there is randomness, or whether there's not, the point is that you're not in control anyway, right? Like, the idea that you want to retain this quantum randomness because otherwise you've gotten rid of free will, it's like, before you even get there, you've got 100,000 reasons to give up your belief in free will. So at this point, if your only justification for retaining quantum randomness is to keep free will, we lost free will ages ago. So that's not a good reason to keep this quantum randomness. And the same kind of thing applies here. Mr. Bell, Dr. Bell, if your only reason for assuming this correlation, or that there's not this correlation, is because of free will, like, dude, like, we forgot about free will ages and ages ago, right? So something kind of like that, I think, is maybe what you're getting at.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you about the issue with the randomness. I think the idea that people have is like, you have this randomness and you get to choose what the pick is. But then, of course, it wouldn't be random, right?
Yeah.
So it's not how it works. So honestly, I think a part of the reason that it's often referred to as free will, this assumption in quantum mechanics, is because that looks good in the headlines. Like, there was just like last week, there was an article in New Scientist about the free will assumption. It was, and the headline was something like, "This experiment can rule out free will," or something, and it's about testing superdeterminism, which I'm very interested in. But why do they have to make it about free will? And so you read the article, and it has this interesting line which says that if these correlations in superdeterminism are real, then that would the laws of nature would constrain what we can do. But the laws of nature always constrain what we can do. Like, you don't even have to talk about superdeterminism. Like, gravity constrains what I can do. Like, this is like, if it wasn't so, it wouldn't be called a law, right? So what superdeterminism does is it adds a new constraint, like, which is this correlation, and that would constrain, in some sense, what the experimenter can do and can't do, because the actions have to fit together with what the other thing does.
Yeah,
it's
as if you've got like a car that's completely broken down and can't run at all. It's just completely broken, and someone comes along and they smash in the front window. And somebody says, "Oh, if you smash in the front window, then the car won't work." That's true. Yeah, if you smash in the window, the car won't work. But it wouldn't work anyway. It wouldn't work even if you didn't smash the window in. Like, oh, there's no if the universe is determined, if superdeterminism is true, then there's no free will. Yeah, that's true, but there was no free will anyway, even before the superdeterminism stuff came in. And I think there's a lot of confusion there. And you're right, people will connect this idea of free will and determinism so that anytime a story comes out, maybe the universe isn't deterministic, the headlines run, oh, look, there's room for free will. But there's just not. They aren't as connected as people actually think they are. And that's something I try to make a point of all the time. When people say to me, do you believe in free will or are you a determinist? And I say, I think neither, I'm not a determinist. I don't know. I'm agnostic on that. But I still don't think free will exists, regardless of whether everything's determined or not. It's much, much prior to that. To explain why would require philosophical argumentation, which I'm not going to get into now. My listeners will be bored to high heaven already of hearing about it. But one thing they might also be bored of is something I've been talking about quite a lot recently, which is this idea of panpsychism, the idea that everything is fundamentally made up of consciousness. And the reason I've made a rather sharp little detour there to mentioning it is just because you said earlier that an example of bad philosophy is panpsychism. I've had a few panpsychists on the show. I've had some people who are agnostic about it and think it's interesting, but I don't really know about it. I've never had someone on, at least not yet, who says that it's bad philosophy. Why do you think it's bad philosophy?
First, before I answer that question, I want to say something about your wrap-up of this free will in superdeterminism thing, because I think it's relevant to note that the people who make this argument about free will, they're all physicists. I've never heard a philosopher make this argument. So this entire connection to free will and all the blah blah about it comes from physicists, and this is an example of why I say I think physicists should pay more attention to what philosophers are actually saying and maybe look up what do they even mean by free will and so on.
Yeah, it's we don't mind when physicists say, hey, there's this interesting finding that the universe isn't deterministic. Cool. That's great. That's physics, and I would never hope to understand how or why you could know that. But I do know that is not a good justification on which to say, maybe free will exists. Maybe you should speak to a philosopher before making those grand philosophical claims.
Basically. Yeah. So about panpsychism, basically, my opinion about this is the following: that there are two types of panpsychism. The one I'd say is properly philosophical, and it's a kind of a flavor of dualism. So it's something that science can't test, and some people think it explains something. Then we can talk about what does it mean to explain something. And then there is a version of panpsychism which has a physical element. It gives attributes. New attributes to particles and to everything else, which is this consciousness attribute, in which case I'd say, well, if that's a physical thing, you're doing physics, and what you're saying is actually wrong. And then you can take a pick, either your theory of panpsychism is wrong, or it's untestable.
What is the thing that would be flatly wrong, in terms of someone's physical understanding for that second kind of panpsychism? What is the thing that they're getting wrong?
So some flavors of the panpsychist theory, they have this idea that they call proto-consciousness or something. Uh-huh. So this is like little elements of consciousness, and if you combine sufficiently many of them, then consciousness comes out. Uh-huh. And so if you do anything to an elementary particle which isn't already there, which isn't in the standard model of particle physics, if it can do anything, like if it has any properties, then we would have been able to see this already. So either it doesn't have any influence on what's going on in the human brain or whatever, then it doesn't explain how consciousness comes about, or it's in conflict with what we have already measured. So sorry, one thing. So uh-huh. you can of course say that this proto-consciousness just doesn't have any properties whatsoever, but then again, it doesn't explain anything, right? It must be able to do something at some point.
So what do you think then of this idea that I mean, the panpsychist of at least one stripe says that the fundamental stuff of the universe is consciousness. Like, what is everything ultimately made of? Oh, well, atoms. What are atoms made out of? Protons, electrons. Or what's a proton? Or it's made of, I don't know, gluons, muons, truons, whatever they're called. What's it all made out of when you get to the bottom? And the panpsychist says consciousness. And it sounds a bit kind of wacky and strange. But one thing that it might sort of point to is why is it that certain subatomic particles seem to do one thing versus another? Like, why is it that electrons are negatively charged? What does that mean? It means that they repel other negatively charged electrons. Panpsychists might look at that and say, a scientist can't explain why it does that. It can explain that an electron does that, but it doesn't tell us why. Maybe the reason is because the electron has some kind of rudimentary preference, and that's what's causing this kind of differential behavior between subatomic particles. And so when the scientist looks at the fundamental stuff of the universe, electrons repelling other electrons, actually, they are observing a very rudimentary form of preference. It's just that they're not thinking of it that way. Humor me. Tell me what you think of something like that.
Well, I would say that doesn't explain anything. That's just a story that you can tell. Unless you can actually write it down and make a prediction with it, I'm not having it. So, of course, you could say, well, everything is made of the same fundamental stuff. Let's call it consciousness. I don't have a problem with it. This is basically a theory of everything. But just by giving it a name, you haven't explained anything. You need to tell me, well, how is it that your consciousness stuff, if you want to call it that way, differentiates in particles that have exactly those properties that we observe? Think of string theory. If you want, why not call the string consciousness? So are you happy with that? If you're a panpsychist? If not, why not?
Yeah, because it doesn't explain anything further. One of the criticisms that people make I say criticisms, one observation or idea that people make about science as a whole is that it's purely descriptive. I talk about this a lot too. And I like speaking to physicists about it. I spoke to Brian Greene about this, for example. The idea is that science only describes things. It doesn't actually explain anything. Isaac Newton is the most famous example of someone who almost perfectly describes the mathematical laws by which the planets all sort of orbit each other and all of this kind of stuff, and describes it with perfection. But when he considers what gravity actually is, or like why it acts in accordance with those particular properties, he says, I've got no idea. Hypothesis non fingo is what he writes. Some people extend that to science as a whole. They say that, okay, so you've told us that an electron is a negatively charged particle. Cool, but why? Like, why is there this thing that repels other negatively charged particles? Where do you fall on that debate? Do you think that science is completely descriptive, mostly descriptive, or that it does actually give us an explanation for why phenomena exist?
Well, I would say you have a weird notion of explanation. So first of all, yes, I think science is totally descriptive. Like, what else would it be doing? But also, like, if you make your assumptions or hypothesis or whatever you want to call them, your axioms of your theory, and you can use that to make a prediction that's actually correct, I would call that an explanation. And it's actually the best type of explanation that we have. And by construction, any theory will always require some sort of assumptions that you cannot explain further. Like those are like the basic axioms where you say, okay, a particle is described by, I don't know, a vector in a Hilbert space with some symmetry group or whatever. And so this is the basic assumption of your theory, and then you use that to derive what we observe.
So this predictive power is important here. Can I give you one idea then, or one thought experiment as we sort of look to wrap up here? I'm imagining, right? So I'm going to do that thing that philosophers so often do, which is come up with completely ridiculous scenarios that hopefully will be instructive to some degree. Suppose I discovered that there was this trumpet, like in this room over here, and if I played a particular note on a trumpet, then a red light turned on over there. And if I play it quietly, it turns on quietly. and if it turns on very, very dimly, and if I play it loudly, it's very bright, and so on. And I'm like, I don't understand why it's doing that. I have absolutely no idea, right? But what I figure out is I describe with perfect accuracy, the relationship between if I play this note at this volume, we get this kind of brightness, and if I do it louder, then I get a brighter bulb. And I come up with a perfect mathematical description that accurately predicts exactly what will happen to the light bulb when I blow through the trumpet. So now I've got this mathematical system that perfectly describes and predicts with every time I try it, it's 100% accurate. It tells me exactly what the light will do when I play a particular note on the trumpet, right? So I've completely and utterly predicted exactly what's going to happen. If somebody then asked me, but why does blowing the trumpet make the light turn on? Like, what's the explanation for why that's happening? And I said, well, look, I think I've explained it as far as I can, which is by coming up with a mathematical description which accurately predicts what will happen in the future. I would feel like that hadn't actually explained anything at all. And do you think that, do you understand the criticism I'm making, I suppose, when I say that it sounds a lot like that might just be what science is doing in general, right? When you've got this great mathematical explanation and this perfect prediction, using that mathematical description, to say that is enough to have explained the phenomenon sounds a bit like the person who thinks that we've explained why the trumpet turns the light on just by coming up with a predictive mathematical model.
So I would say that so you can always ask for better explanations. So maybe you're not satisfied with your trumpet story because you feel like there must be more going on. That's fair. So I don't think that these are exclusive. So your trumpet theory explains something, but there might still be something deeper to be explained.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I don't know if you know this clip of Richard Feynman where someone asks him how does a magnet work, or why magnetism or something, and he gets really frustrated and he says, well, in a nutshell, he talks for a while. He says magnetism is just one of the fundamental forces of nature. Like it's one of the deepest explanations that we have. The electric and the magnetic force, and then we have some other forces, and everything else builds up from this. But there's always a deepest level of for any moment in the history of science. We have a deeper level where we have no further explanations, where we can just say that's it, right? We've gone that far. So magnetism is just there. It's how the universe works. And then you can still ask, but why magnetism? And maybe there's a deeper explanation, and maybe there is a theory of everything. Maybe string theory is correct, or maybe something else. But I think science will always have this end of why, and then you can still ask another why.
Just, it seems to me that trumpet situation, once I've come up with that mathematical description, it almost feels like I don't feel like I've explained it to some degree, but maybe there's more of an explanation. I kind of feel like it doesn't explain anything. Like it predicts what's going to happen, and it describes mathematically what I'm observing. But in what sense, like to any degree, do you mean to say that I have at least partly explained like what's going on with the trumpet and the light? What do you mean by that word explain in that circumstance?
Well, suppose there's someone in the other room and he sees the light going on and off. Sometimes the light goes on and off. And you tell them about your trumpet theory. And then we'd say, oh, that explains why the light keeps coming on and off.
Okay, I see. And but if they then said, but why does the trumpet turn it on? Then you would need a further explanation. But to at least some degree, I would then say in at least some contexts of like the information that you're looking for, it might explain something. But man, I suppose those listening can decide for themselves. And hey, let's boost some engagement. Leave a comment in the comment box down below as to whether you think that counts as an explanation or not. I'm still not sure, but it's one of the great thrills of doing this podcast that I get to ask people from all different kinds of fields. So I've asked the same question to Brian Greene and other physicists. I've asked the same question to all kinds of philosophers, and the one thing that's becoming evidently clear to me is that nobody seems to know for sure. But I appreciate you taking the time to run through some of these ideas with me, and It's been fun. And if anybody is having an existential crisis, there is more to say. There are deeper levels on which we can discuss these things. Your book is Existential Physics, which should be an attractive enough title to anybody who's listened to a podcast like this for this long, and I'll leave it in the description down below. But with that being said, Sabine Hossenfelder, thanks for coming on.
Lovely to talk to you.
Is there any such thing as a cult that isn't bad?
Oh, yeah, sure. There can be a group that has a charismatic leader who has great power and authority, but is relatively benign. And there have been a number of groups like that. The one that I would use as an example would be Arcosante, the organization that followed continues to follow the teachings of the architect Paulo Soleri. His philosophy was called arcology. They had an intentional community north of Phoenix in the desert where they were building Arcosante, this experimental city. But Soleri was a relatively benign leader. There were later allegations regarding sexual abuse of his daughter, but that was within the family. As far as getting complaints about members leaving the group, feeling they couldn't leave the group, that they were being coerced to stay, that never appeared in my work. So I think he was a fairly benign leader, and it was a benign organization. He's now dead, and the foundation continues.
Yeah, I think people might be surprised to hear you say something like that, because when it comes to philosophy, theology, sociology, terms are very difficult to define, right? Religion, cult, words like these are impossible to define precisely. But I think people would generally think that a cult involves things like resistance to anybody trying to leave. You've got your sort of charismatic leader, but there also seems to be this insular and isolated nature to that community. And I know that a lot of people in the anti-cult movement make a distinction between so-called benign cults, ones that aren't so bad, and so-called destructive cults, which are the bad ones. And if it is that the typically bad stuff, not allowing people to leave and stuff like that, isn't intrinsic to being a cult, I think people might be a little confused about what a cult could be then.
Well, so there are three core characteristics that form what I would call the nucleus for the definition of a destructive cult. And every definition I've ever read or heard intersected on these three core characteristics, which are number one, a charismatic leader who becomes an object of worship and is the defining element and driving force of the group, typically totalitarian. And second, that leader uses identifiable thought reform techniques to gain undue influence over his or her followers. And then third, if it is a destructive cult, it does harm. And that varies by degree from group to group. Some groups are much worse than others. So you take those three core elements together, the all-powerful, charismatic leader who is worshipped by the followers in the group, and the use of thought reform, or what has been called coercive persuasion or brainwashing in popular culture. And then finally, that this undue influence that the leader has is used to exploit his or her followers. And you have the crucial elements of a destructive cult.
In that case, if that's how we would define a destructive cult, are those first 2 points just the definition you would give for a cult as opposed to a destructive cult? If there are non-destructive cults, what makes something just a cult?
Well, I would say that you have this all-powerful leader who is the defining element and driving force of the group. So it could be someone like Steve Jobs. It could be Elvis and his fans. It could be the group, the Grateful Dead, who had followers that were called the Deadheads. And they would go from venue to venue following this rock group across the United States as it toured. So you have this, leader or a very small, let's say, triumvirate of leaders that form the basis of the charismatic leadership that defines the group. And then the group has a kind of mindset that is set in place by the leadership that defines the movement and gives the leader great influence and power. Now, if the leader is relatively benign, certainly Elvis wasn't known for creating a compound, exploiting members in any particular way, his fans. So that would be a benign group. And there have been, quite a few benign groups historically in the United States and around the world. And simply because the leader is an object of worship, is the defining element of the group, doesn't necessarily mean that the group is destructive. But in my experience, when you have an authoritarian leader who has no checks and balances and has totalitarian power, frequently it slides into abuse.
Mm. Yes, cult, I believe, comes from the Latin cultus, meaning worship. So certainly the worship of some kind of entity is going to be important here. But I think the thing that's going to jump out to my listeners here, I mostly speak about religion and philosophy. And there's a bit of a meme almost that goes around that people say that, well, religion is basically just a big cult, and cults are basically just small religions. I can't quite put my finger on why, but for me it is incredibly unhelpful to describe, Christianity as a cult, unless you're using like it in a very particular scholarly sense, like the cult of John the Baptist or something. And yet, when you describe a cult being defined as a group of people sort of organizing around a charismatic leader who has some kind of unquestionable authoritative status, things like this, some resistance to leaving, but only in the more destructive cases, sometimes benign. I think at least of like early religious movements, like the original followers of Jesus, and then Christians, Muslims today who have figures like Jesus and Muhammad, who, despite being dead, are considered, alive by Christians and still an object of not reverence, but maybe the kind of thing you're talking about by Muslims, but certainly God himself in both of those cases would be this kind of authoritative leader, sometimes caricatured as something like a tyrant sitting in heaven in a celestial North Korea. So what do you make of all of that and people saying that a religion like Christianity or Islam is just a big cult?
Well, I think that we need to make distinctions and we need to look at it historically in context. And I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of tired of people saying that all religions are a cult and not making those distinctions, because I think it just kind of is not helpful. So is it possible for a cult to evolve into a religion? Certainly. I mean, let's look at Mormonism. Originally, it was all about Joseph Smith. He was the defining element and driving force of the religion. He was the one who supposedly found these golden tablets and created the Book of Mormon and the writings on which the religion stands. Subsequent to his death, Brigham Young took over. And I think arguably it continued to be a personality cult. But after Brigham Young, power began to devolve from the top down. And so now you have church government. You have the first council of the presidency of the Mormon Church, and then you have the first quorum of the 70, second quorum of the 70. The same thing happened with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They were originally known as the Millerites. They followed a man by the name of Miller, and then after his failed prophecy of the end of the world in the 1800s, they coalesced around a woman, Ellen White, who was responsible for much of their writings. But after White died, the Seventh-day Adventist Church likewise evolved and changed. And I think today it's a benign religion that's pretty much mainstream. They still celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday as opposed to Sunday as most Christians, but they have basically moved into the mainstream. They have democratic governance and checks and balances regarding authority and power. And Jehovah's Witnesses would yet be another example.
Yes.
They started as the followers of Charles Russell, and then they
Russellites.
followed a man by the name of Rutherford, who succeeded Russell. But then power devolved, and today the Witnesses, though much more authoritarian than the Mormons, in my opinion, are governed by a group literally called the governing body, which is composed of about 9 men who run Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, they still, in my opinion, are a destructive authoritarian religious organization because of things like their denial of blood transfusions. And many
Yes.
witnesses die every year, children die, because they're not permitted to get a blood transfusion because of the group's beliefs. Also, the witnesses can be very harsh when it comes to excommunicating someone or shunning them, what they call disfellowshipping. And they can cut people off from families and so forth. And then we can look at mainstream religion, and we can look at Jesus, Moses, Buddha, Muhammad. Muhammad is historically well documented. Jesus and Moses and Buddha, not so much. But based on uh, the history that we have available, we could argue that maybe when Moses was alive or Abraham, it was a personality-driven cult. But subsequently, it evolved, and the religion became more about the law of Moses and the beliefs than it was about any particular personality. Jesus is an interesting uh, story because, assuming that the New Testament is historical, Jesus had nothing, wanted nothing, and was really the antithesis of a typical cult leader, in my opinion, because he wasn't looking for power on this earth. And it's hard to say, whether Christianity is the religion of Jesus or about Jesus, because there's so little objective history outside of the New Testament to confirm, what he taught and his philosophy. But it seems like he was the suffering servant of God. And in that sense, he was willing to suffer for his followers rather than his followers suffering for him. And when we look at things like the Sermon on the Mount, it seems like he was a relatively benign, peaceful kind of leader. The same could be said of Buddha. So I think that a religion can start with a charismatic leader and it can be defined by that leader. But after the leader dies, how does the religion evolve? Some cults, personality cults, will just simply disintegrate after the leader dies. Others may continue. For example, Scientology has been called a cult. L. Ron Hubbard died. And interestingly, a secretary of his in his 20s, David Miscavige, who was essentially the gatekeeper for Hubbard in his declining years, became the successor to L. Ron Hubbard. And I would argue that he's probably more harsh, many people think, than Hubbard was. And so rather than Scientology evolving in the direction of becoming more benign, many people would say it's gotten worse. And I would also point out that when cults accumulate great wealth and cash flow, as many have in modern history, there's a desire, a will to keep the thing going, even if it is a scheme or a scam, in order to just take over the assets and the cash flow.
It's complicated, of course, by the fact that, we've been talking about, say, Christianity, but a lot of cults exist sort of as a subsidiary of Christianity, like how the Jehovah's Witnesses started out. I think they used to be called Russellites, right? After
Yes.
Charles
Yeah.
Taze Russell, the founder. And yet that was still sort of a form of Christianity, although like restorationists, they thought you need to reinterpret everything. They don't believe in the Trinity, all of this kind of stuff. But today, like I know some ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and I know people whose family won't speak to them, who knew that if they were to ever leave, their family would be instructed not to talk to them. In fact, I knew one chap who was living in the same sort of house on a different floor to some of his family members, because there was this rule that if you live under the same roof, it's impractical to fully excommunicate, so you're still allowed to communicate with them. And this guy wanted to move out. He was married. He had kids. He wanted to leave, but he knew that the moment he left that particular building and went and lived somewhere else, his family would never speak to him again. And so people like that will say to me, like, yeah, it's a cult. I mean, it's definitely a cult. I suppose it seems like what you're saying is that because it lacks specifically the charismatic leader now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say therefore something like the Jehovah's Witnesses probably best isn't characterized as a cult for that reason?
We might call a group a destructive authoritarian organization or religious organizations. Keep in mind that many cults have nothing to do with religion. Keith Raniere, who led Nexium, which was supposedly a self-improvement seminar-selling company, that wasn't a religion. It was incorporated as a business. And Raniere was, and I testified at his criminal trial before he was in prison, in my opinion, one of the most destructive cult leaders in recent times. Another example would be Synanon, the drug rehabilitation community in California that was started by Charles Diedrich. Diedrich didn't create a religion. It was a rehabilitation community that some people would argue initially was beneficial, but went off the rails. So there are groups that have no religious basis whatsoever. The single most salient feature of a destructive cult is the all-powerful leader. And this is a leader who is determining, depending on the group, virtually everything and anything regarding the members in the group. So whatever the leader says is right. Whatever the leader says is wrong. And the leader engenders dependency upon him to make value judgments for you. And in my experience, the leader typically believes, because the leaders I've encountered are deeply narcissistic, that everyone should think like them, be like them, and that they are, in fact, the prototype for perfection of human existence. And so what you have in many of these groups is the leader instituting a system to clone himself. And when you consider that many of the cult leaders that we can talk about, like Keith Raniere, David Koresh, Charlie Manson, Jim Jones, have been called psychopaths, you see that what they're doing is cloning people to be crazy like them. And that's what frequently happens, is that people begin to lose their sense of self, their ability to function autonomously and independently and think critically, and that the leader essentially thinks for them. So that is what goes on in cults. And all of the major religious organizations, be it Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Islam, have groups that I would call splinter groups that have broken away from them, and typically at the behest of a leader who doesn't want to follow the guidance of the larger religion, but create his own subset or sect that he alone controls and is king over. And all of the major religions have these splinter groups, whether it's the Hare Krishnas with Hinduism, Shoko Asahara and Aum Shinrikyo with Buddhism, Lev Tahor, which is a breakaway group from Judaism, or groups like the People's Temple led by Jim Jones, who was an ordained Protestant minister. And we could go on and on and on. And I think it's important to point out that by taking on the facade of whether it be Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, it gives the leader a sense of authority and more credibility. So if I want to target Christians in the United States to join my particular group, I am going to come to them seemingly espousing Christianity, but not really. And I think the real issue and the difference between religion as we know it in the United States, and or in the UK or in Europe or most of the world, is that by and large religion has checks and balances to power. They have democratic governance or they have some kind of accountability for their leader. Pope Leo was just elected pope, and he went through a process to get to that place where he could even be considered. And there were checks and balances along the way. Now, no doubt we can find fault with the system, but in a destructive cult, there's nothing there. There's just simply the leader, an absolute dictator with no checks and balances whatsoever. And so I think when we say that all religion is a cult, we're really denigrating uh, the the clear and historical definition of what a cult is, and we're also, in a sense, dismissing the difference between a destructive cult and mainstream religion. And there are distinct differences.
To what extent do you think these charismatic leaders who engage in manipulative tactics and essentially brainwashing, ultimate authority, of course, this will vary from person to person, but do you think more of this, psychologically speaking, is people just trying to exert power, trying to have influence, trying to get sex, trying to get money, and knowing that it's all nonsense and just like making something up for the sake of control, versus how much you think it is people genuinely deluded into thinking that they actually are, the Messiah, the unalterable authority? I'm thinking of, for example, Sun Myung Moon, the founder of the Unification Church, or the Moonies, as they are sometimes known, who I think, from reading your book, if I remember rightly, claimed to have met in the spiritual world with Karl Marx and Jesus and Lenin or a bunch of other people in the spirit world, and they all and God, of course, and they all decide to sort of give him the spiritual authority. And he takes out 30 advertisements in newspapers across America to let people know that this meeting took place. I'm looking at someone like that thinking, does he really believe that he is the Messiah, or is he just trying to string people along for a scam? What do you think's going on?
I think that he's dead now. He lived into his 90s, and his family now is reportedly worth over $1 billion. And at one point, they controlled 1/3 of the American fishing fleet and about 50% of the wholesale sushi business in major metropolitan areas in the US. And he built all these businesses on the basis of cheap, low-cost labor, frequently provided by his followers, who he did not really compensate very well. I've talked to many of them. There's a book written, In the Shadow of the Moons, by Nansuk Hong. She was Moon's daughter-in-law, married to one of his sons. Moon wasn't a very good father. One son was a drug addict. Another died in a one-car collision, perhaps due to being intoxicated. Yet another son jumped from a high-rise hotel and killed himself. So the Unification Church is predicated on the idea that Moon is the perfect parent, the perfect father. Hardly that. And I don't think he really believed that he was. I think he was a very arrogant, egotistical man, very deeply narcissistic, as most cult leaders are. But I think that there's pretty much a knowingness concerning the con game that cult leaders play. And I think Moon probably understood that. Did he get full of himself? Did he feel that he could get away with anything? Maybe. L. Ron Hubbard, did he really believe the Xenu story about spaceships from outer space being directly linked to the human condition through a kind of residue of ghosts of aliens that are clinging to our bodies, called body thetans? I find it hard to believe that Hubbard really believed that. I think that he created that myth. He was a sci-fi writer before he was a so-called cult leader. And I think that many of these leaders, and I've met them face to face, Keith Raniere, I would sit with him and deal with him through court-ordered mediation. He sued me for 14 years in a lawsuit that went on and on and on, and was finally dismissed not long before he was arrested and ultimately convicted of multiple crimes. He's now serving over 100-year sentence. But I didn't think that Keith Raniere really believed his own hype based on the way that he interacted with me. And I think many cult leaders are little more than con men. And the difference between a con man and a cult leader is that a con man typically runs their scam, takes the money, and they skip town. A cult leader will run the same scheme on the same people indefinitely. And yes, they do it for power, for money, for sexual favors. And many of them have almost a symbiotic relationship, it seems to me, with their followers, feeding their ego, and that they need that adulation. They need that sense of power and control to just basically keep going. It's what pumps through their bloodstream. It's what they need.
So you came face to face with Keith Raniere, is his name?
Yes.
So what kind of cult did he run? You said that you came face to face with him because he was suing you, presumably because of some critical activity you were engaged with. But what I'm really interested in, after explaining that, is what it was like to come face to face with one of these charismatic leaders, and whether you could see just why his cult was successful.
Well, Keith Raniere was underwhelming, to say the least. I mean, he looks kind of like one of those garden gnomes that you might see in someone's backyard. Not a very impressive figure, poorly put. He didn't dress very well. He didn't present very well. And I would call him a covert narcissist, and someone who is introverted but deeply narcissistic. And so they seem subdued. They seem more quiet, less of a braggart, a person that's really loud and boisterous, what we would call an overt narcissist. So he really kind of tried to project the image of this kind of absent-minded professor, philosopher king, kind of quiet. But he also might be called a dark empath, which means that though as a narcissist, and many people would call him a psychopath, he lacked the ability to have genuine empathy or even sympathy. He had the ability, and this is where he was a savant, to identify the vulnerabilities of people and then drill into those cracks and leverage them for control. So he could figure out, and he devised a system through Nexium in which he would question people constantly through coaches that he had assembled, and that he would find out, what is your pain? What is your vulnerability? What is it that you feel you need more than anything else? And with that information, he was able to manipulate people. And what Nexium supposedly was about, which was the group that he created, which when I first came across it, it was called Executive Success Programs, or ESP. And the people that were part of it were called espions. And Raniere was given the title of Vanguard to denote that he was like on the cutting edge of what the world needed, the technology, he would say, the philosophy, which he called rational inquiry, that he marketed and sold through seminars that cost a great deal of money. And then you had people moving to Albany, New York, to be near him because Raniere lived there. So there were hundreds of people involved in various activities in the group. They would eventually put put thousands of people through seminar training, including two children of past presidents of Mexico and two heiresses to the Seagram's liquor fortune, Claire Bronfman and her sister Sarah Bronfman, each of them worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Keith Raniere would eventually get reportedly over 100 million from those two Bronfman sisters, and millions more from other wealthy, successful people, celebrities, some of them, that became part of Nexium. But as Raniere became more and more powerful and he had more and more control, he became really depraved. He created a kind of cult within his cult that was called Das. And these were women that were his sexual slaves. And he would eventually have them branded, having a doctor using a cauterizing iron to engrave a brand on their pelvis to denote their involvement with this group, Das. And it turned out to be not very well disguised initials of Keith Raniere. And so he was convicted for sex trafficking and financial fraud and numerous things, racketeering, and he's now serving over a 100-year sentence. But it escalated over a period of time. The more power that he garnered, the more he wanted. And for him, the sex wasn't really so much, I think, about his sexual needs. It was about power and control and dominating the women that he tortured and abused.
Thinking about those victims of cults and thinking about victims of cults more generally, a question that comes to mind for me is that I think a lot of people are suspicious of their own ability to be susceptible to cults. And I think one important bit of advocacy that anti-cult activists will do is to remind people that, everybody is susceptible to this kind of stuff in the right conditions. But having said that, are there like predictive factors as to the kinds of people or the kinds of communities or kinds of upbringings and stuff like this that are predictive factors of higher likelihood to be susceptible to joining a cult? Or is it basically random and contingent on chance?
Well, I think there's one narrative that I think pulls through many of the people that I've worked with and talked to that have been victimized by destructive cults. And that is that perhaps they were at a difficult time in their life.
Right.
And they were being bothered by something, their job, family issues, divorce, maybe they had a relationship, it fell apart, they were in school and they were struggling, they had financial difficulties. Whatever that would be, along comes someone, typically someone who's an old friend, a coworker, maybe a relative or a romantic interest, and they tell you, gee, I know you're hurting, and I know of an organization that has something to offer that can help you. And that's how many people initially become involved. And in the process of recruitment, there's so much deception. I would call it like a bait and switch con. You have
Right.
no clue what you're really getting involved in, and they deliberately don't tell you. And that's the difference between thought reform and religious indoctrination. I'm Jewish, and I grew up being indoctrinated into the religion of Judaism. And when I went to Hebrew school, or I went for my training for what we call a bar mitzvah, which is what happens when you're 13 and you go up in front of the congregation and read from what we call the Torah or the 10 books of Moses, I always knew what I was involved with. My parents knew what they were involved with. We were in a very liberal denomination of Judaism called the Union for Reform Judaism. And so that there was no deception involved, and we understood what we were getting involved in. The same thing with a Jesuit or a woman who would want to become a sister of charity, Mother Teresa's sect. within Catholicism. So you know what you're getting involved with. They tell you up front. You know what the demands are going to be. They tell you up front. And you submit yourself to it willingly because that's what you want. That is so different from a destructive cult using thought reform. They do not tell you what their expectations ultimately are, what their demands are going to be, and you really do not make a choice based on informed consent for what you're getting pulled into. And the person you trust, who probably is a true believer, who brought you in thinking that it was the best thing for you, they're also not going to be completely transparent about everything in the group. So you are brought in, and then it's a kind of spoon feeding process of increments as you submerge deeper and deeper into the group. And then clicks in the social isolation that most often happens to various degrees, depending on how extreme the group is. But you essentially become enveloped in a kind of echo chamber or bubble in which you are not getting accurate feedback. And instead, other members of the group are constantly reinforcing the group's beliefs and demands. And so you are essentially, information is being controlled and feedback is being filtered, and you are not getting the true picture. And that's by design. That's deliberate. And so it's very different from religious indoctrination where everything is laid on the table. Do you want to be a Catholic? Go to the catechisms. Do you want to be a Jew? Go to Hebrew school and be confirmed. Everything is upfront, as opposed to being withheld and being micromanaged in the way it is within destructive cults.
What jumps out at me from that then is the idea that people are essentially fooled into joining these cults. No one intentionally joins a cult, right? But the extent to which these cults then prey on the cult members and completely eliminate their communication with the outside world, completely reshape the way that they're thinking. Something that struck me from your book was talking about the Charles Manson murders and how some of the followers of Charles Manson commit some of these gruesome murders and are still in prison for it today. And there was one woman in particular, I can't remember her name, but who's still in prison as far as I know, and she's been there for however many decades it's been, and is repeatedly denied parole because she's committed this gruesome murder. But now she sort of looks back and says, you know, and you write about this, about her sort of saying, like, I was completely stripped of my humanity. I would have done anything. I sort of totally lost sight of myself. And now has kind of been brought around to seeing that she was in a cult, but she's still responsible for these crimes. So she's applying for parole and getting denied. And on the one hand, I'm thinking she's a victim of essentially brainwashing. It's not her fault. She should get to go free. But on the other hand, people are going to think, but she did commit these murders. And to some degree, you could say that about anybody who's a murderer. Maybe it's their upbringing or socioeconomic factors that led to it. And so I don't know, like in a case like that, where it's a bit more of a grey area, do you still consider these people to be victims? And do you think that that should meaningfully impact the way we view their guilt for crimes like these?
Well, look, I think you're talking about Leslie Van Houten. She was a cheerleader, I think. She was from a middle-class family in Los Angeles. There was nothing in her history that would be a red flag saying this person is going to become a cult member and a murderer. But that's what happened. Leslie Van Houten was a teenager when she entered into the Manson family, as it was called, headed by Charlie Manson, which was a very small group. And Manson, by all accounts, a psychopath, someone who basically grew up in juvenile facilities, the prison system, came out of prison and started to manipulate people and dominate people. He was in his 30s, and he collected these very impressionable young people around him, including Leslie Van Houten. And she would eventually kill in the Tate LaBianca murders. She stabbed Mrs. LaBianca, I think, 26 times. It was a horrific, brutal murder. And it shocked Los Angeles in the late 60s. And so that became, she was originally sentenced to death. And then ultimately, she did get parole not too long ago. But she spent, like a half a century locked up in prison. And I remember when I received a call from a member of the LaBianca family called me up, and I had written and spoken about Leslie Van Houten and pointed out that before she met Charlie Manson, she was not a criminal. She was not in trouble. There was nothing there to indicate that this would be her ultimate lot in life. And then during the time in prison, when Charlie Manson was no longer able to influence her, she went on, she became a college graduate, she counseled other women prisoners. She was not a violent prisoner. She was seen as essentially a model prisoner. So the Manson cult was an anomaly in her life. It represented this one space of time where she was completely different than she was before or after. And I would attribute that to the influence of Charlie Manson. But when one of the LaBianca family called me up, what they said to me is they said, Leslie Van Houten was originally sentenced to death. And then when California at one point abolished the death penalty, that sentence was commuted and she was sentenced to life in prison. I don't think this member of the LaBianca family said to me that she should ever get out, because my family has suffered so horribly that there's no way that we can ever be made whole. There's no way that these family members can ever be returned to us, and they're dead. They will never have another chance. And so she was vehemently opposed, the woman who spoke to me, to Leslie Van Houten's parole. And I think there is a line where cult members cross into criminal activity where they are punished. And in some situations where it involves horrible crimes like murder or horrible sexual abuse of children or adults, it's reasonable to think that they should be punished. But I recognize that they have diminished capacity. That is, that they were under undue influence and that they would not have committed the crime if they were not under that type of control.
It's a really unique kind of case, because I'm sure the law is filled with examples of people being literally coerced into committing crimes, or people who plead insanity, but it's a sort of midway case here with cults, and I'm not sure how long it has been that people have really been aware of cults as like a phenomenon to be taken seriously in this regard. And so I suppose people are still kind of working it out, but I think it raises a big sort of moral question mark. I mean, I'm tempted to say, like, of course she should be in prison, but maybe it should be like a factor in the sentencing, some kind of inhibiting factor. But I can totally imagine why a victim of a family member of the victim wouldn't see it that way. It does make me wonder then, as well, since you mentioned that Charles Manson's cult was incredibly small, and we've talked about a group like the Moonies, who were absolutely massive. I don't know exactly how big they were, but a huge organization. Of the two, the sort of really small, tight-knit cults, who I suppose could be like more isolated, but there are less members to keep up the status quo, versus these huge organizations which cannot keep track of and micromanage every single member, but there are just so many people and so many communities to sort of keep you in the fold. Of those two, which do you think is a more dangerous kind of cult, the big ones or the little ones?
Well, it really depends on the leader. The leader is the defining element and driving force of the group. So as the leader goes, so goes the group. And even though a group could be quite large, the way in which the pyramid scheme of authority is built, there are all these levels of authority that are ultimately being dictated to by the leader at the top. and there are mandated ways of dealing with others in the group that the leader determines and that are implemented systematically. So you have groups like the Children of God, which was led by a man by the name of Moses David Berg, who was a pedophile, a predator who raped his own daughter, his own granddaughter, and mandated that members in the group have sex with children. And so in the group, there were children that were being raped at the age of 4. And these children, needless to say, grew up in a very tortured, very difficult existence. And Berg was really kind of a shadowy figure that was not ever present, but that the edicts that he had through his Mo letters and his authority were mandated through the systematic implementation in the group. And so all of these children suffered. And I've talked to many of them as they left the group, they were adults. The actor River Phoenix and his brother Joaquin Phoenix, their family was in the Children of God. And many of the children that come out of the group come out with very conflicted feelings about what happened to them. You know, they love their parents, and yet their parents were part of their pain because their parents either allowed sexual abuse to occur or were part of it, and the children were hurt. So they have this love-hate kind of relationship frequently with their parents. Uh, Another example, though, to point out is Jim Jones. Jim Jones, at one time, headed a very large church in California called the People's Temple. And they had thousands of people going to church services. And they were considered by many to be a very dynamic, a very positive church because they had programs to help the elderly, to rehabilitate drug addicts, and so on. And so they were seen as a social action kind of church. And Jim Jones was seen as a mover and shaker in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was at one time very friendly with the governor of California, the head of the state assembly. He was kind of a local celebrity. But as his power grew and it was unchecked, and that was the problem, was they did not have a system of democratic governance to check and balance Jim Jones. And he was a deeply disturbed personality. Many would say a psychopath. He also had substance abuse problems. So as he deteriorated and became worse and worse, so did the organization that he headed. And this is the dilemma or a formula for disaster in cult groups, which is they are so firmly attached to the leader that as the leader loses his ability to make rational judgments and becomes more and more crazy, if you will, the group becomes crazy. So what happened with Jim Jones was he got worse and worse until eventually the media exposed him and he left California with more than 1,000 of his most loyal followers, and they went to English-speaking Guyana, where they created a cult compound in the middle of the jungle, which became known as Jonestown. And it was there in 1978, under government scrutiny, that Jim Jones decided to pull the plug. And he wanted to die, and he took all of his followers with him. They were either murdered or coerced to commit suicide, and 900 people died, about 300 children. So this is the formula for disaster. You have an entire organization that is wholly dependent on the sanity of its leader. And when that leader is a psychopath, a malignant narcissist, the possibilities are that even if that leader isn't really bad comparatively at one point, without any checks or balances to his power, he might run off the rails. And that's what we see over and over again in cult tragedies.
If I'm not mistaken, an investigation into Jonestown was commissioned by like the US government. So they sent a congressman to Jonestown to check it out. And while he was there, some of the members were like handing him notes saying like, I want to get out of here. And I don't know the exact details of what happened next, but it wasn't pretty.
Yeah, well, that was Leo J. Ryan. He was the congressman from that district that included the People's Temple, and many of his constituents were coming to him and saying, you know, my family member is in Guyana and I can't get them on the phone. There were no phones, there was no communication, there was no newspaper, no radios. Jim Jones controlled all information and communication, which is a scenario you see that plays out in many cult groups. The more extreme the group, the more extreme the control to enforce what the leader wants. And so the people that lived in Jonestown were unable to communicate with their families in California. So Leo J. Ryan went with the agreement of Jim Jones on a fact-finding trip to see what was happening with these people who overwhelmingly were from his district or from California. And when he went there, of course, there were people passing notes, take me with you, help me, save me. And when Ryan left, he left with some of the people from Jonestown. And so Jim Jones knew that when they left, they would tell what was really going on inside Jonestown, which was that Jim Jones had his own prison, he had his own police force, and he was ruthlessly totalitarian and controlling of all the people in there. And he was sexually exploiting some. So that he didn't want that truth to be known. And so he decided to kill Leo J. Ryan and the people that were trying to leave. And Ryan was assassinated. He was murdered. And I think after that, even though Jones was in a very, strange kind of bizarre, fantasy, conspiracy-driven state of mind, he had the presence of mind to know it was over and that the authorities would eventually come to arrest him, as they were from Georgetown in Guyana. And so he infamously mixed what they called the Kool-Aid, which was a Flavor Aid punch, with cyanide and barbiturates. And that was given to hundreds of people. The children had no choice. They were given poison by either their parents or by adults, and they were murdered. And then there were people that tried to escape. They were forced to take the poison. There were people that were shot. So it wasn't simply a mass suicide. It was, by and large, murder. And Jones had determined that I'm going to die, and therefore you could see it as almost like this incredible act of narcissism. Without me, you are nothing. And therefore you must all die with me, because what will you be without me? And so they all died. And
Do we know what he said?
918 people. Yeah.
Do we know what he actually said? Because presumably he didn't say to his followers, like, the game's up, the police are coming for us, it's time to get out of here. He must have said something a little more dramatic, a bit more narrative. Do we know what the actual message was before they all died?
Yes, he told them that this was an act of revolutionary suicide in response to a cruel world that didn't understand their truth, that resisted their sense of social justice, that they were making a statement that the world would note that the world was so unjust. And as many cult leaders have said, whenever there are situations where they're being held accountable for their behavior, this is persecution. We are being persecuted. Not I am being held accountable for my behavior, but we are being persecuted. And therefore, we will commit revolutionary suicide in order to make a statement. And that's what they believed. The followers of Marshall Applewhite, a very small group called Heaven's Gate, that they all died, 39 of them, in California in the 90s. They were told by their leader, who had been in and out of mental institutions and also considered a psychopath, that they were going to ascend to a level above human by shedding their earthly containers, meaning their bodies. So the leader, Marshall Applewhite, a deeply troubled individual who controlled everything in this small group, convinced them that the way for them to evolve as human beings was to shed their bodily containers. So they took a concoction of uh, phenobarbital. They went to sleep. Most of them were suffocated with plastic bags over their heads. One, I think the final person that was left, uh, inflicted a gunshot wound and died. And so that was the way that Heaven's Gate ended. But I don't think any of them at the time were thinking, I'm killing myself. They were thinking something idealistic, something that was consistent with the group's philosophy. And that was the way in which Applewhite controlled them to death. And this is what's so sad about so many of these groups, is that the members believe that they're doing something idealistic, they're doing something positive, when in fact they aren't.
Given how depressing this reality is, that sounds quite dramatic, but as we said earlier, it's surprising how susceptible people are to getting to that point. And if you think that you're not the kind of person that could fall for a cult, that probably means you're all the more likely to fall for a cult because you're less likely to see it coming. I suppose what I want to ask you is a question I'm sure you get asked quite a lot, which is like, if you're worried about like a friend who's hanging out with a new group of people and you're not really sure what's going on there, what are some of the red flags you should look out for? Not necessarily for like a cult for you yourself, but like behaviors of someone you know that might indicate that they're getting into something a little bit dodgy.
They're becoming isolated, social isolation, that increasingly you're not hearing from them, they're not communicating. They seem to be submerged in this new group they're involved in to the exclusion of family and old friends. That when you ask them about the group, they go on and on about the leader. And
Mm.
it seems like the leader is perfect, that the leader can do no wrong. And when you ask them about, anything that might imply there might be a problem with the group or a question about something that they're doing, that the response is uniformly that the group can do no wrong, that the leader is always right, and that there's this total intolerance for any type of critique, and that those who criticize the group are always wrong or even evil, and that there's no legitimate reason to leave. That when you ask about people, are there people that have left your group? Are there people that have moved on to a different church or organization? They're stigmatized. They're vilified, and the narrative is there really is no legitimate reason to leave.
Mm.
And many of these groups have troubled histories, so you can use AI or you can use Google and search down their historical information, and you can find it online, and you can see that there's a pattern of grievances about the group that are consistent, that the same kind of problems happen over and over again, which means that this group has a troubled history and that there are people that have been hurt.
Mm. We've spoken about like historical cults, speaking a lot in the past tense, or we talk in the present tense about sort of borderline cases like strange religious groups. But are there still today any like well-known cults that like you can point to as immediate red flags if you hear a particular organization or whatnot? I think if people were asked to name a cult today, they might struggle outside of saying things like Scientology.
Well, in my opinion, Falun Gong which is the group behind the Shenyun dance company, is a deeply troubled organization that has been called a cult many times. Its leader is a guy that is called Master Li, and they believe that he has supernatural powers, that he can become invisible, and that the truth of the universe is channeled through him. And so Falun Gong is not simply some type of traditional Chinese uh, organization, nor is the Shenyun Dance Company or the Epoch Times or Epic Times newspaper that is also controlled by Falun Gong just any newspaper. So that would be one example. Another example would be, of course, Scientology, which is still very much present in the world. And then there are groups like the Unification Church that have not ceased to be, that are still very much in recruiting and active today. And what I would say is that the way that groups recruit has changed. So what has happened is they are now online. So virtually anyone with a smartphone can be targeted by a group, that they are streaming their indoctrination, that they have videos on platforms like YouTube, that they are on TikTok, X, Twitter, Facebook. They have groups on Facebook that meet online, and that the way in which they fundraise, they receive money through PayPal, through Venmo. So the way in which a cult is created, the way in which it recruits, the way in which it extracts money from people has changed. The internet has changed all of that, so that minor children, and this is coming out more and more. There was a series called Adolescence that I'm sure that you're aware of, that brought out the fact that teenagers, kids, minor children can be influenced by uh, online influencers, whether it be the incel, intentional celibate movement, or some other misogynistic type of organization that will encourage, this kind of hypermasculinity that culminates in altercations and at times violence. And likewise, radicalized groups will recruit online. Uh,
Mm.
you know, for example, Hamas has recruited online, and other terrorist organizations. So cults increasingly are starting online and proliferating online. And in that sense, there are so many groups, it's impossible to keep up with them. One group recently was exposed called Twin Flames, that there was a documentary done. And this was a group that has been called a cult, led by two people. They recruit online, they interact online, then they have their offline group meetings, seminars, etc. But the premise of the group was that they will find your true spiritual partner for you. They will find the person that you are meant to be with. And this became very manipulative, very destructive, when women were told that they they needed to become a man in order to find their perfect partner, which would be another woman in the group. And this really became very destructive, because women who otherwise would never have considered this were being coerced by the leaders of the group, according to former members that have left, to change their sexual identity. So again and again, what we see are these groups are pernicious, and that they expand in whatever medium they can. And given the internet today and social media platforms, it's much easier for them to find people and recruit them than ever before.
Mm. It also makes it sort of vaguer to me. I mean, thinking about adolescence, for example, I think they name Andrew Tate, maybe his brother Tristan Tate. These are the the sort of the big names of the kind of movement that we're talking about, this whole manosphere type thing. And a lot of people look at guys like that and see them as essentially a kind of cult leader. And there is a sense in which everything you're saying makes sense. It's almost as if they can do no wrong. They can say essentially anything and they'll have people lapping it up. But it doesn't have the organization. It doesn't have, I mean, I think they have like online courses and stuff, and God knows what actually goes on behind that paywall or whatever. There is this idea, this element of, exploiting people for financial gain, selling products, that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it sort of doesn't feel like there's a proactive encouraging of like shunning and disfellowshipping, the kind of thing that you see in more organized cults. So when somebody describes something like the movement you've just been talking about, this sort of online, nebulous, manosphere, masculinity type stuff, as cult-like, do you think that's appropriate? Do you think this stuff is more in line with what we were talking about earlier as cults, or more like the sort of more nebulous religion or that kind of thing? Like, where do you think that kind of thing fits into this definitional paradigm?
Well, I think Andrew Tate is right there on the line. I mean,
Right.
he is currently facing criminal charges, and there are allegations that offline he was presiding over a cult-like group of people that lived together, and that he was exploiting women and so on, and that he is this kind of driving force, defining element of his following, and that they worship him in the sense that they see him as iconic, they see him as the prototype of what they wish to become. And so he is being criticized as being a cult-like leader or a cult leader, and these are the allegations that surround him. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that cults are, they're not all the same. So if we say the word cult or we say destructive cult, that doesn't mean that they are all equally destructive. So there are many cult leaders that are simply happy to make a lot of money and have low cost labor of their followers and become very rich, as many of them do. And they don't sexually abuse their followers. They don't physically abuse people. They operate on a continuum at a less destructive level. Now, having said that, there are cult leaders that start out at that level and then become worse over a period of time. That was Keith Raniere's story. But there are many, many cult leaders who are simply happy to be very rich, live luxuriously, have people wait on them hand and foot, and are not planning a doomsday mass suicide or any kind of physical violence or criminal activity. And it isn't until the group crosses into criminal activity that the authorities become involved on the basis of those criminal acts. So I think it's important for us to recognize that the groups that end in murder and suicide are the very small minority of destructive cults. That the majority of them are destructive in the sense that they exploit people financially, that they inflict intentional emotional distress on people, that they cause psychological and emotional damage, that they traumatize people, and that trauma follows that individual, could be for years. Many people will leave a destructive cult without ever really unpacking what happened to them. And so they will live out the rest of their life blaming themselves, saying it was my fault, or if the group is religious, religiously based, saying, well, I betrayed God by leaving the group. I'm a terrible person. And they've never really unpacked what happened to them. I see this over and over and over again, people self-blaming, carrying this incredible feeling of guilt and shame that they have over being involved in a cult without understanding what was done to them. I would say that people typically are tricked and then trapped in these groups, and that it is not their fault that they have been preyed upon and taken advantage of. And if they did have weaknesses and vulnerabilities that were the leverage that the leader used or the group used to manipulate them, again, it's not their fault. They're merely human to have their frailties and their weaknesses, as we all do. And that these groups are relentlessly predatory and they take advantage of our weaknesses. And it is not the victim's fault any more than it's the fault of someone who's been raped. uh, you hear people say, well, she was asking for it. She was dressed provocatively. She was looking too sexual. And so, not surprisingly, she was raped. I have heard people talk that way. And that has happened historically, is that people are blaming the victim. And I think that we should never blame the victim of a destructive cult, and that we should recognize who is to blame. And it's the predatory nature of the cult that is the problem, not the person that has been preyed upon.
That's when, again, I'm thinking of like the Charles Manson murderers and why that poses such an ethically difficult case, because I think what you say is quite compelling, and people will intuitively listen and go, yeah, we shouldn't blame the victims. But when you're faced with a case like that, it's very difficult for people to just say, oh, whatever, that sort of wasn't her fault. It's complicated, to say the least. But I think quite insightful here, as you said, that people who've left cults have sort of interesting psychological insights to give about how they still associate with the cult and maybe still feel like religious guilt despite having left. Maybe they sort of haven't abandoned all of the beliefs or something. But what it makes me think is how do people generally escape these cults, and where do attempts to get people out of cults go wrong? Because I imagine a lot of people try it with family members and friends that they're worried about and completely and utterly fail. Where do they go wrong, and where do they go right?
Well, first of all, most people will leave cults on their own, not
Right.
through an intervention.
Okay.
And typically it will be something shocked them. They saw something happen in the group that caused them to be shocked, to feel, I can't handle this. This is too terrible. I need to leave. Or they're exhausted. They're simply exhausted. They've been working too hard. They've been uh, uh, they've been exhausted by the group and the demands of the group, and they feel like, I just can't go on. It's too difficult, it's too painful, and I'm going to leave. But then, because of their indoctrination in the group, they may feel that this is something that they should be ashamed of, that I should have been stronger. I should have been able to work 60 hours a week. Why 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 couldn't I just keep doing that? I should have been able to not be in touch with my family. Why did I feel so homesick? It was a weakness that I loved my family. I should have put God first, meaning the group, because in the mind of the individual, a higher power or a higher purpose is fused with the group in the sense that you feel that you're not deferring to the leader, you're deferring to God, you're deferring to a higher order, a higher principle. And so you feel that when you walk away, you have betrayed that. And so that's kind of the baggage that people may leave with. But typically they leave because it was too hard, it was too difficult, the group was too punitive. They saw people suffering, they saw things that happened that shocked them, and they left. Now, what will help them after they've left is to do quite a bit of study and reading and research about what is a cult, how does thought reform or coercive persuasion work, what are the mechanisms that are used to manipulate people in totalistic groups. And if they can do that, they can unwind the group programming and understand what happened to them. And in that way, essentially free themselves from the guilt and the shame and get on with their life. And there are a number of books that people can read. Of course, I'm going to plug mine, Cults Inside Out, because the book not only has a history of modern cults, but it has a narrative of former cult members talking about what happened to them. And what the reader will see is, even though the groups have completely different beliefs, that the same things are happening in the same way to people in various groups, despite their differences in supposed beliefs, doctrines, etc. And then also there is a chapter examining what we call cult brainwashing, which is really a synthesis of coercive persuasion, thought reform, and influence techniques with the research notes so people can drill down and find more information. And then I describe what I do in interventions. I've
Yeah.
done over 500 interventions across the US and internationally. I've worked in the UK, I've worked in Ireland, and I've worked in across Europe. So, what happens in an intervention is basically education and sharing information. And that boils down to 4 basic blocks of discussion. Number 1, defining what is a destructive cult and asking the question, does that fit the profile of the group that you are currently involved in? Number 2, what is coercive persuasion? What is thought reform? And are there parallels between the criteria that would distinguish a thought reform program and what your group is doing to you now? And then number 3, what history of the group do you not know that you should know to make a more informed decision about continuing with this group? Are they withholding information from you? Do they have secrets that they don't want you to know? Why aren't they telling you their history? Why aren't they sharing these things with you? And then finally, the 4th block, why did your family decide to do an intervention? What was it about your behavior, uh, your choices, or your actions in recent history that caused your family so much concern that they decided to bring me in and stage this intervention? And so you go through that. It could take 3 or 4 days of discussion. And during that time, you're asking the person to not communicate with the group or people associated with the group, and to take a temporary time out to discuss what the family is concerned about and the various things that I've outlined. And then at the end, they will decide to do what they want. Some decide to return to the group. I would say about 30% of the people that I work with at the end will say, I want to go back to the group. I'm happy there. That's what I want to do. And the family will accept that. All they want is the time allotted to discuss their concerns. And then many of the people I work with will say, I'm leaving in the first day. I'm not even going to stay here for a day. So out of the 30% that I'm not effective with, many of them leave in the first day. Many of them leave early on, some at the end, but mostly in the beginning. They just decide, I don't want to continue, or they're in touch with someone in the group and they tell them, hey, get out of there. We don't want you to talk about these things with anyone. Come back to us. Uh, Ignore your family, ignore their concerns. So that's how people get out through intervention. But the overwhelming majority of former cult members, they simply walked away.
Mm. It must be quite difficult to convince people to sit down for an intervention in the first place. I mean, especially the type that's likely to sort of walk away. I mean, do you sort of? I'm imagining somebody who's sort of in a cult, and it's kind of hard to get a hold of them. They're already kind of distant. You just sending a text message saying, "Hey, would you mind popping over so we can do a 5-day intervention where you take a break from your..." Like, how do you get people into that situation?
Well, sadly, many of the families that contact me, I'm going to tell them there's nothing I can do for you, because it does require meaningful communication, meaningful access, that things are not so far gone, either through the cult's efforts or because the family has had so many heated arguments about their family members' involvement, that there's no more communication. Or if they live in a compound, and there are a minority of cult members, but there are a substantial amount, they live in an intentional community or a compound with other cult members, and the family absolutely has no access. And
Right.
in situations like that, I will tell the family initially, look, there's just nothing I can do. I have a chapter in my book called Coping Strategies to coach families on how to improve communication, hopefully leading to a better place where they might be able to stage an intervention. But in most cases, there is enough communication and there is enough access that a family could stage an intervention. And so what they do is they have a designated time when I'm going to come, and when the family member is there. It could be a son, a daughter, it could be a parent with adult children initiating the intervention. It could be a spouse. So I come in as a total surprise, and we sit down, and the family will introduce me, and the family will say, "Look, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And what we want from you is just time. Would you be willing to give us the next 2 or 3 or 4 days, uh, not grueling, where we talk for a while, we break, maybe we spend 7 or 8 hours a day in discussion. And then would you be willing to do that? Because we love you, we're your family, and we really feel this is important to us. And what we would like you to agree to is to just give us the time. And then you will do whatever it is that you want to do, and we will respect that. But we would like the time to talk with you about why we're worried, why we're concerned. And usually, most of the people will say, okay, fine. I don't think
Mm.
it's necessary. I think this group I'm in is great. Everything's wonderful. Some of the people will say, hey, this is maybe an opportunity for me to explain to you why you should get involved in this group
Yeah.
and how it could help you. And the family will typically respond by saying, great, then we can have an exchange of ideas and discussion. And we brought Rick in, me, because I'm an expert. I testify as a court expert in court proceedings across the United States and internationally, and so I am here on the basis of my expertise to share what I know, and your family is here as eyewitnesses to what has happened, and we just want to talk things through. So in that sense, it's kind of like a drug or alcohol intervention, which
Yeah.
typically begins as a surprise, and the family pleads with the individual to hang in there and talk things out with them. And that's eventually the format or the general structure. But what is discussed is very different, and the crucial difference with a drug or alcohol intervention is that in those interventions, the liquor store owner or the drug dealer are not trying to sabotage the intervention,
Yeah.
but the cult, given any opportunity, will try to sabotage the intervention. And that's why you want the person to agree not to be in touch with them during the days that you're having this discussion, this dialogue.
Mm. Well, you mentioned the fact that a lot of interventions for alcoholics, for example, are surprises. You don't text them and say, "Hey," you just sort of the image is walking home and all your family are sat there like, "What's going on here?" What do you think about the ethics and the efficacy of involuntary interventions for cults?
Well, as any of your viewers can find out, I myself was involved in involuntary deprogramming or involuntary cult interventions back in the 90s. Actually, 1991 would have been the last involuntary intervention I did. And quite frankly, I went through legal hassles over it. The families involved went through legal hassles. And basically, it was abandoned. But in fairness, I want to say this, that the families that retained me in maybe 24 adult interventions that I did on an involuntary basis, where the family hired security and they would not let the person go, were in extreme situations that involve frequently cult compounds, inability to access the person, and very extreme groups. I think it's fair to say that it could be a life or death situation. I've been involved in interventions where the group said, don't take your insulin, don't take this medication that you take to avoid convulsions. And then the person could die as a result of the cult's influence. Or there were situations where children were being horribly abused, and the adult needed to leave the group in order to take their children with them. Because another aspect that we haven't discussed is that people are born into and grow up in groups called cults,
Of course.
where what we consider crazy and abnormal to them is everyday life, and that abuse is the norm, and harsh corporal punishment, sexual exploitation, labor violations, working kids. I mean, these are the kind of things that go on, and children suffer, and some die in destructive cults. There was a group in Australia that denied a little girl, 10 years old, insulin, Elizabeth Strauss, and she died. And now the parents and other members of the group will be going to prison for their complicity in her death, that they wantonly denied her insulin and she died a very painful death as a result of the teachings of the group and the leader of the group. So back in the 70s, the 80s, when involuntary deprogrammings were taking place, not all of them were life or death, but many of them, and in fact, a majority of them, were with groups or organizations that there was no way to access that individual, that there was no way to do a voluntary intervention, or with very limited possibility of success. So that's why parents did that. But because of the legal complications, that is, lawsuits, criminal prosecution, that form of intervention has been abandoned. And I don't know of anyone that does it currently. And I think it pretty much ended around 91, 92.
It sounds really dramatic. I mean, the idea of it's one thing to say it's a surprise versus an invitation, but for there to be security to physically not let someone leave. I mean, firstly, I'm trying to imagine like how the person, the people that you were involved with in these cases reacted, and secondly, like, does it work, or are they so sort of trapped and imprisoned that they just consistently saying, "Let me the hell out of here! Like, I'm not going to listen to you."
Well, I'll tell you a, a, a case history in exactly that, which was a young woman. She was a college graduate. She had a postgraduate degree. She became involved in a very extreme group. And this group believed that the members of the group should be sterilized. And so men got vasectomies, women got tubal ligations and cauterizations so that they could not have children. The woman that I eventually would work with was 26 years old. Her family wanted her to be able to have children. They wanted her to have all the opportunities in life. they chose to do an involuntary intervention. This was in the late 80s. And I was the deprogrammer or intervention specialist that worked with the family and with this young woman. And she became very, almost really violent, screaming, chanting, did not want to listen to anything. But at the end of a period of days, there were about 5 days, she gradually changed, and she listened, and she took in the information, and eventually decided to leave the group. And years later, she sent me a card with a picture of her daughter, a baby that she had had. And I think what she was telling me was, "Thank you, and I'm thankful for my family because I can have a child." And there were so many people from this particular group in California that they could never have children, even after they left the group. There were women that I appeared with on a news program to expose the group, and they said, I finally realized that I left the group for good reasons, and it was good that I left. At the time I left, it was very painful. I felt I was turning my back on God, but eventually I realized it was a cult, and that the leader was not God, and that he was demanding and unreasonable. And I left because it was the right thing to do for me and for my family, meaning her parents, extended family. But that same person said, "But I can never have children. I know that the group is a cult, and I won't go back, but I will never be able to have children because I have been sterilized." So those are the stakes in some of these interventions. Another woman that I worked with had a particular disease that caused extreme convulsions, and she was on a medication to obviate that, to take care of that, deal with that. And the group was telling her not to take it. The parents' fear was first that their daughter would die, and so they did an involuntary intervention, and she came out of it. She left the group. She was in touch with me. I haven't heard from her in a while, but she used to call me every now and then, and we had an ongoing joke, which was when I was working with her, at times she would drift into a kind of trance, and I wouldn't think that she was hearing me. And I would say to her, "Hello, hello," and I would like knock on something and say, "Is anybody home?" And she would look at me and she'd get angry and say, "I'm here, I'm here." And that was my way of engaging her. And she would call me on the phone over the years, and when I picked up the phone and I'd say hello, and she'd say, "Hello, hello, are you there?" And I would always know it was her. And incidentally, I worked with Harvey Keitel on the Jane Campion film Holy Terror, which included Kate Winslet. And Harvey, I was his technical advisor, and there was a scene in Holy Smoke where he behaved in the same way. "Hello, hello, are you there?" to Kate
Right.
Winslet, who was the cult member. And that was from Harvey and I talking about cases that I had done.
Wow. Wow, that's pretty cool. That's a pretty cool stamp that you've made on popular culture there. Uh, Okay, those sound actually quite successful, and it's a shame that there are so many legal complications even in these extreme cases. But most people listening to this, anybody who's thinking, gosh, I think I know somebody who's susceptible or something's going on, maybe they don't really want to stage a whole intervention, maybe they're just looking to sort of talk to their friend. Where do people go wrong, like on that level, when they try to sort of say to somebody, hey, let's have a chat about this? They sit down for an hour over coffee and they say, look, listen, I think you're in a cult and you need to get out. Where did they go wrong?
They're too harsh, they're too judgy, they haven't figured out the best approach, which is to be calm, to be conciliatory, to say, well, what's going on with this group? Talk to me about it or whatever. To not be threatening or confrontational or critical or negative, and to just be open and to be a good listener and to listen to them. Because quite frankly, about half the calls that I get or emails are from people where they think it's a cult and they're wrong. So the first thing that you should think is, well, maybe I'm wrong, that I think the group is a cult because maybe they're a little weird and they believe things that are somewhat strange. But as I often say, it's not about beliefs, it's about behavior. How does the group behave? How is the group structured? Can it objectively be defined as a destructive cult by virtue of the structure of its authority and the group dynamics and its behavior, not subjectively because I don't like what you believe. I don't like your doctrine, because in my opinion and the way I see it, uh, if a group has weird beliefs, so what? It's none of my business. It's only when the group is doing something that is destructive and that is hurting people that people like me become involved, or for that matter, law enforcement. So keep in mind, if somebody you think they're in a cult, you may be wrong and you may just be overreacting. And
What
you
kinds
might
of
need to just
groups?
chill out a little bit, do some
Yeah.
reading, do some research. I mean, come on, we've got OpenAI, we've got ChatGPT, which is not always right. A lot of times I'll ask AI something and I'll see mistakes and whatever, but we have the tools to explore the background of a particular group and find out more information about them. And it behooves you, if you care about somebody, to do the research first, not later, and find out more about what they're involved in, because you may be wrong. You may just be overreacting.
What kinds of groups, just briefly, like, do people call you up and say, I'm worried about my friend who's in a cult, but they're not actually a cult? Like, what kind of groups give people that impression?
Oh, well, Freemasonry, Wicca,
Right.
uh, nativistic kind of voodoo, Santeria, or whatever, that may be relatively benign. They don't have a dictatorial leader. They're not hurting people, but their beliefs are strange. You know, um, uh, I think that the Satanists, though their beliefs may be repugnant to people, are not causing direct harm in the way that other groups are that have been called destructive cults. So
Yeah.
there are exceptions. There recently was an online supposedly Satanist group that was targeting kids, but that's the exception, not the rule. And for the most part, I find Satanists, Wiccans, witches, Santeria, and so forth to be relatively benign. And though the beliefs are strange to the mainstream, that doesn't make them a destructive cult. Likewise, there could be a kind of philosophical group or a political group that we don't agree with, that we should not label a cult simply because we don't agree with them. For example, I would not call the so-called woke movement a cult any more than I would call Donald Trump a cult leader. I think that there are groups that we disagree with, that we look at them and say, well, I don't like what your political platform is. I don't like your agenda. And therefore, I want to denigrate you. And I'm going to use the word cult because that makes me feel like you're brainwashed if you don't think how I think. That is not really helpful. And that is not what a destructive cult is. It's not about whether they agree with your beliefs. It's about how do they behave and what are the group dynamics and how is authority exercised in the group.
Even in the case of a Trump-like figure who many criticize, particularly because of insistence on loyalty, surrounding himself with yes men, firing people who exhibit, contradictory attitudes, and then a movement which crops up around him, which, when somebody gets up and says that they're a socialist, they say, oh, you've been brainwashed by the woke media, and you're not thinking straight. And again, it's kind of hard to judge because it's on such a sort of broad scale, but in the way that you just said, and I wouldn't say that any more than I would say Donald Trump is a cult leader, but some people kind of do say that about a man like him, Famously, he said he could shoot someone in New York and his followers wouldn't do anything, right? It's sort of a lot of resonance with the kind of stuff you're talking about.
Well, Trump comes across as very narcissistic and self-indulgent and, and so on, which makes him disagreeable to some people, but it doesn't make him a cult leader. I mean, there are many movie stars, actors, celebrities who are very narcissistic, who have a kind of posse or entourage that follows them, that agrees with whatever they say, that are sycophants. But that doesn't make it a cult. And what I think Donald Trump is more of a vessel than he is a cult leader. That is, that the sentiments and the grievances, the feelings of the Republican Party, the base of the Republican Party, that he identified all of the most important issues for most of the Republican Party, and he gives voice to their grievances, their sentiments, their fears, in a way that that has engendered their support. And if you look at Donald Trump's history, I see him more as a salesman than a cult leader, someone who understands his target market, and in this sense, it would be the Republican base, and he understands what they want to hear, and he speaks to their deepest held feelings. And I don't think that the people that support him suddenly change their feelings or their political attitudes or their grievances, but rather it just flowed through him. And in that sense, he is more beholding to them than they are to him. I think if, for example, Donald Trump said, well, I think that we should have immigration reform, and we should have work visas for people that are harvesting crops and in restaurants and hotels and in construction, because we need those people. And they should be given some leeway, a pathway to citizenship. I think immediately Donald Trump would no longer be followed by the Republican base, that they would, as they say, throw him under the bus. And in fact, he did a rally in Alabama at one point, and he spoke in favor of vaccinations because one of the vaccinations was produced through something called Operation Warp Speed. And that vaccination was quite effective in the COVID pandemic. And Trump said, what about that vaccination? Wasn't that great? I hope all of you are vaccinated. And he started getting booed. And in my experience, cult leaders are not booed. Cult followers are not allowed that privilege to boo or show discontent in that way. And instead of Trump denouncing them and saying, take all of these negative people out of here, he changed and walked back what he was saying and morphed it into an issue of, well, if you don't want to take the vaccine, you shouldn't have to be forced to take the vaccine. Vaccine should not be mandated. And then the audience started to clap and then cheer. And if you watch Trump in many of these interactions at his rallies, he's playing to the crowd. He's playing to the audience. It isn't like the audience is simply obedient and subservient to him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And I think, again, it's probably helpful in the way that when people say, like, religions are just cults, it's like, I know what you mean, but it's probably quite unhelpful to annex that kind of terminology where it doesn't properly belong. Because of the kind of work that you're doing, it will blur some of the lines and confuse the sort of information that people need to know. One other, before we wrap up here, like there is one other specific thing I wanted to ask you about, just because in terms of the popular understanding of cults, this random thing just sort of burst onto the internet recently, went super viral. There was this viral video of a group of people sat singing quite a strange sounding but very beautiful song in a language that most people listening didn't understand, and it looked very sort of community oriented. They were all sort of sat in a room together, and it looked really nice. It almost looked like a family get together around the campfire or something. And upon looking into who these people were, they were part of the John Frum cargo cult. What is the John Frum cargo cult?
Well, that is a group that is based on I think it's isn't it the Sullivan Islands or somewhere islands in the
It's
Pacific?
somewhere in the Pacific.
Yeah, Solomon Islands, I believe. So it's a very isolated group that had interaction with Western countries, and they began to kind of worship this man that had landed on their island and shared these great things from the West with them. And they began to idolize this individual who came to the islands, and they began to worship the things that he brought, and they were called a cargo cult. But this is not a group that has an authoritarian leader today that is making demands on the people. It's more like really kind of like the Deadheads and the Grateful Dead, and the idolization of someone, and being a fan of that person and what they represent. So I think you can have what we call a cult following, which means fans, a fan base, and that's different from the type of cult that would be called a destructive cult.
Yeah, so I mean, my favorite example of a cargo cult is the so-called Prince Philip movement, as it's described on Wikipedia. But I think sort of relatively well known that I think it must have been that Prince Philip, who was the husband of the late Queen Elizabeth II, they visited these islands, and the islanders see the reverence with which these royals are being treated, and conclude that the man, the husband, must be the sort of divine type figure. And so there's this community of people in, again, like an isolated island somewhere in the South Pacific, who like worship Prince Philip. They've got like pictures of him, and Prince Philip was told about this cult, and he sent them a picture of himself, and they sent back this like pig killing baton thing. It's like a traditional thing from their culture, and at their request, Prince Philip like poses for a photo with it and sends it back. And it's just bizarre, and I think it's got something to do again with this sort of visitation. And some of these cargo cults, they'll build sort of, I guess, ceremonial airstrips, because of course when they were visited in the past, an aeroplane came down and dropped off all these goods, and so they build these airports out of out of wood, essentially, because in some of these cargo cults, I think they might believe that this is somehow going to attract back this mythical figure like the John Frum, who's going to come and drop off the cargo. But yeah, fascinating to think that there is a community of people even today after his death who idolize and worship Prince Philip as a divine figure because of this kind of visitation that they interpreted in this way. And I think if there's any evidence of the proneness of people to, under the right circumstances, be able to adopt what from the outside might seem like some of the most insane and inexplicable beliefs you could conjure up, I think this provides a good example and a reminder that, a lot of us are susceptible to a lot sort of wackier and more esoteric beliefs than our current circumstances might have us believe?
I think the important thing the takeaway is, does the group hurt people? So the cargo cult doesn't have a history of hurting people, and they're simply fascinated with this colonial figure who made them aware of the Western world and things that they thought were magical, that represented a higher form of, evolved technology and so on. But there are leaders of nations, political leaders, not Prince Philip, but let's say Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, or for that matter, Joseph Stalin or Lenin, who can be seen as cult leaders in the sense that they were the defining element and the driving force of what was happening in their country. For example, people didn't say Heil Germany, they said Heil Hitler, and they saw Hitler as a messianic figure. In the same way, we now have North Korea, which has had three successive generations of leaders from the same family who are worshipped as semi-divine, as virtually supernatural. And they can be seen likewise as cult leaders. So it is possible, and we've seen it historically, where people become a cult leader and they have a movement behind them, and that movement is political and it takes over an entire country. And the leader is worshipped. I mean, if you go to Russia today, you can visit Lenin's tomb, and his body has been, embalmed and preserved. And so this is evidence of the fact that he was an object of worship. And there have been political leaders in that type of position.
Yeah, you talked about Trump earlier getting booed and sort of changing his message. What came to mind then was the video, I'm sure you'll have seen, you can watch it on YouTube, of Joseph Stalin in front of a room of his party, and he starts listing off names, and the people who he names, a soldier goes over, picks them up and takes them outside, and these names start getting listed off, and people are nervously sat there, and as the names keep going, some of them start standing up and hailing Stalin and shouting their praise at the top of their lungs because they're just terrified of what's going to happen if their name gets read out. I think it's a list of alleged traitors or people engaging in conspiracy, and those people get taken outside and everyone's terrified because they know what's going to happen to them. Slavoj Žižek said to me that there was an old joke about like a person who criticizes Stalin and another person who says, hey, you can't criticize Stalin, and it's the second person who gets sent to the gulag first, because the most important thing is that sort of at least pretense of ideological certainty. And of course those people were killed, and it does pose a stark contrast to the Donald Trump saying, I hope you're all vaccinated, and getting booed by the Alabamans. So I understand, let's not downplay people's political fears or anything, but when we're talking about cult leadership of the kind that you're describing, it is a different level of worship and personality and authority and certainty, I think. And I think that is an important note to say, and perhaps a good one to end on too. So, Rick Alan Ross, the book is, as you mentioned earlier, Cults Inside Out. It will be linked in the description, of course. Some of the stuff we've been talking about, you go into more detail, more examples. Fascinating, like really, really strange and wacky stuff going on in the history of cults beyond the already wacky and strange stuff that people are famously familiar with. So I would really recommend anybody who's interested to go and check it out. But thanks for taking the time. It's been an interesting one, a bit sort of different to the stuff I usually talk about, and I hope people have found it interesting. I certainly have.
All right. Well, let me know when it's up, and I'll link to it.
Cool.